So thank you everyone for being here, and especially given the entertainment that's waiting outside to decide to join me here for this last day of the ASSC. I'm really grateful and humbled to have the opportunity to talk to you all about the research that I did during my PhD on the neural basis of motor awareness. But before I dive into the experiment and the data, I wanted to take a minute to make sure that we are all on the same page about what I mean by motor awareness and what kind of experience we were trying to study. And for that, I want you to imagine that you've decided to try bungee jumping and that you're standing right next to the edge of a cliff, getting ready to jump. And if I imagine myself in that situation, I can imagine that I feel a growing feeling of readiness that maybe comes and goes as I get ready to jump and then have doubts about whether I should actually go ahead and jump off the cliff. And then if I do decide, I would imagine that I get ready, increasingly ready, feeling really, really ready to go, and then eventually feel something like, okay, now is the time to jump. And then eventually I would jump off the cliff. And I think that this example captures nicely two aspects of motor awareness that we may experience when we do these kinds of spontaneous actions that are not immediately triggered by anything in the environment. We freely decide to jump, and we decide when to jump and if we want to jump. And I think that William James himself gave the best account of these two kinds of experiences that we might have. He said that it often happens when the absence of imperative is perplexing, that we find ourselves acting as it were automatically, as if by a spontaneous discharge of our nerves. But this sense of motion after intolerable pent-up state is so exciting that we eagerly throw ourselves into it. Forward now, we cry, though the heavens fall. And this very dramatic rendition of these two kinds of experiences, I think, captures, on the one hand, the pent-up state, this kind of graded feeling of readiness that can come and go, that can be stronger or weaker, and that can last for seconds or even minutes as we ponder what to do. And on the other hand, this discrete moment in time, the forward now moment, where we feel we have decided that now is the time to jump. Now, in the literature on motor awareness, this latter aspect of motor consciousness is the one that has received the most attention, the discrete moment in time when people feel that they are about to move right now. And this was pioneered by the studies of Benjamin Libet in the 1980s, which many of you are probably familiar with, where he asked participants to make a movement whenever they felt like it, in his case, flexion of the wrist, and he asked them to make a mental note of the position of the rotating hand of a clock like this when they felt that they had made the decision to move right now, when they felt the urge to move. And what he famously showed was that participants reported becoming aware of this urge to move only about 200 milliseconds before actually executing the movement, although there was a neural signal, the readiness potential, that was present in their brains long before that. Now, much has been said about this study, and I'm not here to discuss all of its interpretations, but one key thing is that one of the interpretations that was made of this was that, well, if people don't become aware of their intention to move until this late in the process, how can they possibly control that? But these sort of interpretations are ignoring what happens before. This experiment was not aiming to describe whether people have conscious access into the full motor preparation process that precedes the decision to move right now. It was only asking people, when did you commit to the decision to move right now? And so what we were interested in studying is what happens before, what happens from the moment that people engage in the task of moving every once in a while, what kind of neural processes are responsible for this preparation, and do people have conscious access into that? And I think that for that it helps to position spontaneous actions like these ones, of moving whenever you feel like it, in the more general context of a decision-making process. So deciding to move whenever you feel like it is a decision like any other, which we can assume follows a diffusion to bound process with some variable building up to a certain threshold, and that will trigger a movement once that threshold is reached. And in fact, it has been suggested that the W time, the will time, or the time that people reported as being the urge to move, corresponds to this threshold crossing moment, the moment when there's a decision variable that hits a threshold and makes people move. In fact, we have evidence from other areas of study, like perceptual decision-making, that this seems like a plausible hypothesis. It has been shown that when people make a perceptual decision and report their subjective decision time, that is the time when they decided where, in this case, a set of dots, whether a set of dots were moving to the left or towards the right, this subjective decision time is nicely captured by a threshold crossing model that can be estimated with computational modeling. So this seems a plausible hypothesis. But what I want to focus on is that if we are to find the neural correlate of this feeling of readiness, this continuous feeling of readiness that can come and go, there's two key aspects of this computational decision process that we can look at. We can look on the one hand at the decision variable itself, some sort of signal that builds up during the preparation, or we can look at the threshold, the bound that determines when an action will be triggered. And I will argue, or I will try to argue in the rest of the talk, that we have two neural signals that are good candidates for representing these two computational aspects of the decision. On the one hand, the readiness potential as a decision variable, and on the other hand, the beta desynchronization over the motor cortex. So what do we know about these two signals, and why do I think they are relevant? The readiness potential is a slowly ramping negativity that's typically observed before spontaneous actions over the motor cortex. The best account that we have of what it's reflecting is the stochastic accumulation model by Aaron Schurger that was developed about 10 years ago, where what he says is that we can assume that there's a noisy accumulation process. There's noise that's been accumulated in the brain. If we assume that when this accumulation process hits a bound, then people move, and we align the EEG signal to the threshold crossing moment, that is, we align the signal to the movement, like we do in all of these kinds of experiments, then we can recapitulate pretty much the sort of neural activity that we find in the readiness potential. On the other hand, what we also know is that the readiness potential does not seem to be a signal that people can voluntarily control. And we know that from neurofeedback experiments, for example, where experimenters try to get people to reduce the amplitude of their readiness potential while making spontaneous actions by giving them neurofeedback after each single trial, but they were unable to do that. And I think in a way this is consistent with the idea that this is a fully stochastic signal that's just accumulated and that seems to fall outside voluntary control. What do we know about beta desynchronization? We know that when people prepare to make an action, be it spontaneous or evidence-driven, the beta power over the motor cortex decreases, indexing a higher motor excitability, and we know that this lateralizes contralateral to the moving limb shortly before action. We also know that it seems to reach a pretty stereotyped level irrespective of reaction time at the time of action, and it is often taken in perceptual decision-making tasks as marking a threshold for action because it always reaches the same stereotyped level before people move. These average beta band dynamics are best explained by single trial bursting activity over the motor cortex, so we can also look at how single trial burst dynamics relate to movement triggering. And finally, in contrast to the readiness potential, the beta band power is very much under voluntary control. And we know that both from neural feedback studies, where again participants are trained to reduce or increase their beta band power based on single trial feedback, and also from the fact that people strategically adjust their beta band power in order to better control behavior. So for example, in tasks that require a speeded response, we typically see shifts in the baseline activity of the beta band power so that beta band power is lower, which means more preparation when people need to make a fast response, as you see here. So in contrast to the readiness potential, this seems to be a signal that people can very much control and use to regulate their behavior. So knowing that, our question was, do any of these preparation signals that we know are related to action triggering relate to the conscious experience of feeling more or less ready as people prepare to move? And when we were trying to answer this question, we started by looking at the readiness potential. Now, when we want to study this feeling of readiness, we importantly want to study what happens before people move. So it makes no sense to ask people, how ready did you feel to move after they have already made the movement? Because of course they felt very ready. And we know from many other studies that there is a high potential for confabulation if you ask people about how they felt after the fact, after they have already done something. So what we did, inspired by work by Matsuhashi and Hallett, was to develop a random probing method. So we asked people to make their self-paced task whenever they felt like it, and then randomly interrupted them with a probe. So they were looking at the letter stream, like the one you see here, flickering at a roughly 4 Hertz frequency. And they were told that if they saw an orange letter, that was an awareness probe. And what they had to do was, if they felt ready if they felt that they were already preparing their next movement, they were asked to press a key, to report that they felt ready, that they had a conscious awareness of their next movement, whereas if they did not feel ready, they were told that they should ignore the probe. And our reasoning here was that in contrast to the traditional way of looking at the signals, which is locking to the action, we then look at what happens before the probe. We were hoping that by interrupting at random times, we would interrupt people at various stages of motor preparation. So if the readiness potential, for example, is carrying some information that people can access when probed about their intention, if the readiness potential is the signal that they're using, then we would assume that when we align trials and sort them according to whether they reported awareness or no awareness, we should be able to see a trace that looks like a readiness potential when they reported being aware, and instead we should see nothing of the sort if they reported not being aware. That's again under the assumption that the readiness potential is the signal that they are using to make their reports. And so we went ahead, ran the study, and this is what we found, which we were very happy about. But in this study, we asked participants to make the awareness judgments with the same hand that they were using to make the self-paced task. So you have to imagine you're sitting in front of the computer, you're pressing a key with your right hand, and then sometimes you see an orange letter. And what we were thinking is, with the orange probe, what we will manage to do is to prompt people to kind of accelerate their actions. It will be most natural if we ask them to report with the same hand. But the problem with that is that it could be the case that when people moved after the letter, some of those movements would not be genuine awareness reports, would not be cases where people saw the orange letter and said, oh wait, yeah, I was about to move, and then pressed the key. But those might be instances, but there might be some instances where the probe happened to appear at a time when people would have moved anyway. So, for example, there would be trials where people had already initiated the neural chain of events that leads to a movement, then the probe came, and then they moved. So those would be instances where people were not giving us a genuine awareness report, but rather were moving in a self-paced manner. And in this paradigm, we couldn't really disentangle the two. So we then went ahead and tried to dig deeper into the question and disentangle these two types of trials. And we ran two more experiments that were a variation of this original paradigm. So still the same idea, still looking at the letters and still being interrupted by probes. But in the second experiment, we asked people to report awareness with a different effector, so with the hand that they were not using to make self-paced actions, so that we could tell which of the responses after the cue were actually genuine awareness reports as opposed to movements that might have happened anyway. And in the third experiment, we moved away from the binary reports and instead asked participants to rate how ready they felt on a scale from 0 to 7 when the cue appeared, to try to get at the feeling that, at the idea that this feeling of readiness is graded and that people can have a greater or lower experience of how ready they are. And so looking at the second experiment, what we found was that actually it is the actions that would have happened anyway that are driving this readiness potential signal before the probe. And what I want to point out is that if you look at the reaction time distributions to the right, the blue bars are the actions that people made with the hand that they were using for the self-paced task. And you can see that in the very early reaction time bins, there is a bunch of actions that were only of that kind. So when people moved under 200 milliseconds after the cue, that couldn't possibly be a reaction to the orange letter. It's something that would have happened anyway. It's too fast to be a reaction time. And what we know is that for those actions, it's very likely, highly likely, that there would be a fully developed readiness potential because people were about to move anyway. So we are interrupting the action very late on. And instead, for the awareness reports, of which we got a good few, we could not see any trace of the readiness potential preceding the cue. So this seemed to suggest that it is not indeed the readiness potential that they're reading out when they are telling us how they feel about their motor preparation. And confirming this later hypothesis, when we tried to look at the readiness potential according to how ready they felt, we found no evidence that there is any kind of linear relationship between how negative the readiness potential is and how ready they report feeling when asked about that. So at this point we thought, okay, this seems pretty convincingly to show that it is not the readiness potential that's informing their feeling of readiness. What else could it be? And as I primed you for, we turned then to the beta desynchronization, the beta the beta power over the motor cortex, which I remind you is a signal that decreases as people prepare to move, that seems to reach a stereotyped threshold, and we were hoping the same. If we manage to catch this signal at various levels of preparation, and this is the signal that's informing participants' readiness ratings, and we should see this correlation between the signal and the graded readiness ratings, and we should see that in the binary report task, when people report being aware of an intention, their beta band power is more negative than when they are not aware of that, indicating that they are more ready to move. And this is actually what we found. So looking again at the same two experiments, the last two experiments that I showed you, when we look at the trials where people responded to the orange cue with the hand that was specifically designed to produce awareness reports, we found that the beta power over the motor cortex was at its lowest. It was lower than when they pressed the key with a regular self-paced hand, and it was lower than when they did not move at all after the cue. And perhaps more compellingly, when we look at the graded ratings, here we also found evidence for not only a binary split of the awareness aware versus unaware trials, but even a more orderly relationship between how much the synchronization there was over the motor cortex and how ready people reported feeling. And we find the same if instead of looking at the average beta power, we look at the burst count for each single epoch and how that relates to the readiness ratings that they gave us. So to summarize, we were on a quest to try to find what are the neural signals that people are reading when they report how ready they feel to do a task, what kind of motor preparation signals might be informing participants' feeling of readiness. And we used a random probing method, which is the best way we found to avoid the classical caveat of asking people about intentions post-talk after the fact, after they have actually moved. Across the three experiments that we looked at, we now believe that the readiness potential is related to the immediate triggering of an action. When an action is about to happen, we can find the readiness potential there. And what we effectively did here is to jitter a little bit how far these actions that we're averaging are. But we still find the readiness potential. We take that the readiness potential is the decision variable in this more computational model of how people make spontaneous actions. And instead, we think that the beta power, which is plausibly a marker of the threshold for action that the decision variable needs to reach, does correlate with the subjective feeling of readiness. And I wanted to make a note about what I think is relevant about these findings, which is going back to what I said at the beginning, that people do have control over their motor preparation signals. They do have control over their beta band power, and it looks like the signal that they can consciously access to inform them about how ready they are is also a signal that they can voluntarily control. So that raises questions about how tightly coupled these two things are. Is it, can we test whether the people that have better access into these motor preparation signals also have better control into their motor preparation processes? So I think it raises interesting questions. And it also raises interesting questions regarding regarding our understanding of voluntary control in the specific case of spontaneous actions. Because if we believe the Schurger model of the readiness potential, that is a stochastic signal, and we may not have control of that stochastic signal, but the way that we may control whether we make wrist flexions or spontaneous actions may be through controlling the threshold that such a stochastic signal needs to reach. And just to conclude, I wanted to take a step back and look at the bigger picture, because you may say, well, this is all well and nice, but these are all spontaneous actions that are really arbitrary, that have nothing to do with the real world. What do we make with this? People normally make actions that are informed by the evidence around. They actively seek information in the environment. Can we take something out of this that's relevant for these other kinds of decisions? And I would argue that in any decision that ends up in an action, the motor cortex is involved. So knowing that people can consciously access the activity over the motor cortex is relevant for that. In my current work with Simon Kelly in Dublin, we are working on decision-making tasks where people accumulate evidence, and in those cases, the decision variable is something that we can measure on the parietal cortex, like the central parietal positivity. We know exactly how much evidence we give to people. We know exactly how that evidence is processed, and we can look at early sensory evidence accumulation processes, as well as how they are then fed onto the motor preparation signals. And it looks like the beta band, the beta power over the motor cortex, is very sensitive to the evidence that's being fed on a discrete token task, for example. And so we can potentially ask the question, are people not only aware of how ready they are to make an action or how close they are to making the decision, but can we also use these sort of signals to ask, do people know how close they are to making this decision as opposed to this other? And is the difference, for example, between the two hemispheres when they are making a decision a good index of their perception of that? Can we look into the black box before they have committed to an action by looking at the same sort of signal in a completely different and kind of more general context? And then there's still, of course, lots of open questions. It's not clear whether the readiness potential per se is present or absent in tasks where people accumulate evidence and make actions. But the lateralized readiness potential, which is the late component of that, which lateralizes contralateral to the moving limb, definitely is present in evidence-driven decisions. And this opens the question, what is exactly the relationship between these two components? Can we actually conclusively prove that one is the trigger that determines when exactly an action happens and the other one is the bound? These are the open questions that we're hoping to answer in a more general decision-making framework. And that's all I wanted to say, apart from thanking everyone that has participated and helped me think about these projects. A special shout out to Carla, who is here in the audience today, and to everyone that I've worked with, and to you for listening. Thank you.
Thanks. Great talk. Really, really nice. We've talked a little bit already about like probe method studies and what is going on in them, but the distinction you make between like feeling ready and the feeling of like initiation is a really nice one that I hadn't really thought about too much. But the fact that, so in the example you give of the bungee jumping, you have this feeling of readiness that waxes and wanes, and you're tying that to beta desynchronization. And you also say that the beta desynchronization is something that we're more in voluntary control of compared to the readiness potential and the stochastic accumulation. So one, there's two potential resolutions to that, because it doesn't seem like the feeling of readiness in the case of like the bungee jumping is something that we're in control of. One possibility is that we are in control of it and something else is stopping us, or that the feeling of readiness, or that there's something else going on. And with that in mind, what do you think about adapting like Libet-style paradigms to having those cases, having situations where you're like, oh, I'm scared to go. I'm being stopped by something, rather than I feel free to proceed whenever I feel like it. Like, how can we make it more ecologically valid towards the bungee jumping example?
Right, so you mean having a paradigm where we can actually measure this coming and going of the beta signal? That's a good question. I think it would be lovely to see that. The tricky question then becomes, how do we measure it? Because as long as people, if you're having people track it with a cursor or anything, they are already moving, so you're not going to see that. It would be a matter of finding a clever method that can get people to track how ready they are to move without them actually moving. And I wouldn't know how to go about that, but it would be very interesting to see, and that I think would help elucidate whether it is actually the signal that's tracking this coming and going.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah.
Okay, questions? I see Ilse right there. Yeah. Yes, I see you collaborated with Sadlen. So I was wondering, you know, from their work in monkeys in perceptual decision-making in LIP, that they see this accumulation of evidence before the decision is made. I wonder how this differs from the conscious feeling of readiness, because this is more like an unconscious process. How you can distinguish?
Well, I think so. From part of the work that I'm doing now is trying to relate these LIP findings in monkeys to EEG markers that we have of the evidence accumulation process, such as the CPP or the P300, depending on the task that you're running. It's an open question whether we are measuring the exact same thing. And it's also, I guess, a question of how conscious the monkey is of that. If you were to probe the monkey, for example, before the evidence accumulation process has finished, would he be, could you estimate the probability that he's going to respond one way or another, for example? And I guess that's the question here. So what I would like to see next is if we have a paradigm where we can measure, for example, the extent to which people are preparing a left-hand movement as opposed to a right-hand movement, and we interrupt them before they have actually committed to a decision. Is this a good marker of how committed they feel to either side? And if we could, yeah.
Conscious experience of the preparation for the decision, kind of?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and I would think that this counts as conscious awareness of your ongoing decision process, right? And then it's a separate question, what do we do when people are making decisions that don't require a movement, and that I wouldn't know. But I think it would already be nice if we can show that graded feelings of commitment to one option or another before the process has been terminated are related to a signal that we can track.
Hi, yeah. Maybe just a very simple understanding question so that I get the gist of it. So, so what you have been showing is that the readiness potential is not correlated to conscious awareness that I'm going to move soon, but some signal in the beta band. Could you maybe say one more time, what is it in the beta band that correlates with this conscious awareness of readiness?
It's the average beta band power.
The
average beta band power, and the other thing that I mentioned is that the average beta band power is basically a summary measure of the bursting activity in the beta band. So on a single trial, if you look at a single trial, you can see that it's not flat. There's periods of high power activity, which are defined as beta bursts. And what happens is that as people prepare an action, those bursts become less likely. And so when you average all those trials, you see that on average there's less power over the beta band. But basically that's saying the same thing. So it's just the beta power over the motor cortex is what's correlated with the feeling of readiness.
Okay, let's take one more from the back there. If you just pass the microphone back.
Great talk. I was curious if you've thought about this in the context of some findings in Parkinson's disease. I think Helen Bronte-Stewart at Stanford has been using a beta signal from the subthalamic nucleus to trigger brain stimulation to subside symptoms, right? And so this is beta in the motor cortex, but clearly there's a difference in the will and the ability to control movement, right, in Parkinson's, and if you've considered how this is related.
I have read about some of these studies, but I haven't tried to get at the link between what we observe over the motor cortex and the possible subthalamic activity. But I think it would be very interesting to see, and I think it's definitely going to be linked somehow.
It seemed consistent because I think they're looking for an increase in beta band, and that triggers the stimulation to block the freezing, right, or the tremors.
Yeah, so more beta bursts mean more inhibition, so it would be difficulty initiating movements, for example. So it would make sense. It would be coherent with that. Yeah.
Cool.
Thanks.
Okay, many thanks, Elisabeth, for a really interesting contribution.